Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Istio networking community meeting. Today we have several topics. First, there'll be a follow-up on the roadmap discussions we had in the past. And then next, we're going to discuss a bit some issues related to MTLS and multi-cluster and readiness props. So there's quite a bit of an agenda. Hopefully, we'll be able to cover everything. I want to, first of all, share my screen. I'm not sure if Louis was able to join. Okay, so I think Louis, he did mention having a conflict today. But let me share my screen and discuss a bit a document that will be presented to the TOC in the next meeting and covers a bit the aspects of releasing like 1.2 and what kind of features get into 1.2 and so on. And then we can see how this maps with the roadmap we discussed in the past and our like stack of features, right? Just give me a second, see how I can share my screen now, because, okay. And then I guess from, all right, I think it's from this one. Okay. So it's taking a while to load. Okay. Yeah, the link is the first one in the work group meeting notes. So you may also want to open that link separately because I'm having issues sharing here. Okay. Luckily, people are still joining, so let me try again. There's something. Okay, yeah, Stephen, thanks for sharing the doc. No, I cannot, unfortunately, I cannot share my screen for whatever reason. So if you could please follow the link that's in the meeting notes and also like post it in the chat. It leads you to a document that is called Plan for Istio 1.2. And further down in this document, there are like many aspects being covered, especially as they relate to the Code MOV initiative. But somewhere in the doc here, there is a networking section. So maybe let's see. And it's called specifically features networking. And I'm highlighting this. Are you able to see that? Yeah, okay. Okay, great, thank you. So in this doc, so the features that are deemed valuable and are likely to pass the 1.2 bar are first of all related to scale in pilot. I think that has always been a high priority. Second, it's the refinements to namespace isolation, as this relates to the user experience. So this is basically everything that was related to the sidecar CRD that was released in 1.1. There are further improvements needed for that. So they are likely to meet the bar for the 1.2, okay? And then there are a bunch of like user experience items which are the elimination of container port requirements, the listening of the refactor of the pilot listener. There are a few approaches related to that. The dependency on the port name for protocol identification, And in here, what's listed that supported promiscuous ingress listeners. So it's a bit of a new thing. I don't remember having discussed this before, and it ties a bit to the listener item from before. So it's the ability to configure a listener that will operate in promiscuous mode and will solve many of the or not many, some of the issues related to the container port requirement, as well as some of the readiness problems where we've been having. Okay, and there is also it's marked as a P2, some tooling related to the multi-cluster federation, multi-cluster and generally mesh federation. I don't know why this is P2, it should probably be higher, but that's to be discussed with the TOC. Okay. So in addition to that, there are other items that may pass the bar, and it's actually specified down below where it says what shouldn't be in 1.2 with some exception. And I'm highlighting this big block of things. So there are some exception. For instance, there is the pilot endpoint work. Ingestions of endpoint with the MCP protocol will likely meet the bar. Also, everything that aligns with the namespace isolation we discussed already, and everything that's graduating an existing API to beta will not have problem. So items that relate to improving the code base, making it more stable and all that will meet the bar. Okay, but we probably should not be doing general refactoring work that doesn't have an immediate need, from any point of usability or reliability, and doesn't improve testability. Okay. On the other hand, my expectation is that any test should be able to pass this bar. Okay. Are there any questions related to this? This is fresh, hot, how is it called? Hot off the press.
Andrea, I'm wondering, there's work that I'm not really clear on the status of, but some refactoring between Pilot and Galley. Is that sort of done? Is that in scope for 1.2? What's the feeling on that?
So do you mean the pilot decomposition?
Yeah.
So that is basically when I say MCP, it's tied with the pilot decomposition. So that one has high chance of meeting the bar. Okay. But
okay.
there are as we Nino and Nate are working on this. There are various things to be solved. For instance, one of them is the readiness of the probe, and it's the third or fourth bullet item in the agenda today. So as we try to move towards this model, we discover various technical issues that we're solving one by one. I think the tricky part is to be able to move to that model without making a big refactoring on Pilot. So it has to be, a bit of a gradual move. But long-term strategy is definitely to move towards this model. It's not going anywhere.
If I can jump in on this topic, I think the big problem we had in 1.1 was that we had a bunch of changes that took a very long time to stabilize. And many customers are unhappy because, again, we're introducing instability into their production environments. My understanding of the goal for CodeMove is to make sure that 1.2 release is improving in the stability and, kind of making sure that everything that we tell people to use in production is well tested, is mature, it's solid. Many of the changes that on this list will likely be disabled by default, and we are not, because again, having something become mature doesn't happen in 2 months. It takes a bit of testing. It takes not only automated tests, but some experience in production. We are talking about the listeners. I mean, pretty much everything on the list that is new feature. I personally have high doubts that it will be production quality in one cycle. So I want to make distinction between stuff that will go in as alpha quality because it's brand new and didn't get enough kind of stability testing, and the main goal, which is to have the features that we already shipped that people are using in production, be super solid and kind of bulletproof. That's my take, at least.
Yeah, that sounds great, Costin and Andra. There's kind of been a late roadmap request for distro-less containers, and actually somebody's done a prototype, and that seems to work. So I think we can take that up in the environments meeting, but we may want to consider adding that to this master list, and because it impacts security as well. So just something to consider.
I think it is covered already. I mean, part of security and part of new installer works that is already. I mean, the new installer work is perfectly in scope of that. I don't think there is any issue. I commented on the PR in particular. My concern is to make it properly so any base image can be used by people when they build systems, not only distro-less.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. So Steve, I know this document is very new, right? So do spend some time, go over the various items, and because they may be networking environments or security, and please add to that. I'm not sure when is the next TOC meeting, if it's on Friday or the week after, but it's a good idea to bring your input as to what should make the bar, right?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay.
I hadn't seen this document, so this.
Yeah, it's very new. So, and so I think that's the update for now related to the roadmap. We'll probably have one more, round of updates in the next meeting, just to reconcile this list with our initial list that is recorded in the meeting notes, and we'll see. I guess also there might be some room for negotiation with the TOC, but the respective stakeholders need to really do the work about that. So if you have a feature and you think it's not going to impact stability, maybe for instance, I don't know, in the CNI that would be completely separate, or it's again separate installer or something else. Maybe it will put the bar. It's the TOC who decides in the end. Does it make sense? Okay, good. So now I was able to share, so hopefully everybody can see this. If not, let me know. So we'll move to the second item. And Andrew, it's good you're here because you opened this issue and are asking about, I guess, is it guidance, or you already have a proposed solution?
Yeah, so actually the Adam Jalot opened the issue, but I happen to have the same one. And so basically what I want to do is talk a little bit about what we see and get confirmation that we're understanding it sanely. And then, there's kind of, I think, two broad ways to go about solving it. And so I wanted to know what the recommended approach was, and then I'm happy to do work to try to fix this, but that's kind of where we are. So broadly, this bug is there's a bunch of things like Kafka is the example where I found it, where Kafka wants to talk to it's Kafka that there's a controller node. It wants to talk to other nodes to do this gossip protocol. One of those nodes is itself, and it happens to talk to itself on its external pod IP address, not 127.0.0.1. And when it does that in this configuration, what happens is it gets directed to Envoy, but Envoy maps it to the inbound listener and not the outbound listener. And so if you have something like you are requiring a mutual TLS between pods, then only the inbound policy gets applied and the connection gets rejected because you only went through inbound, which requires MTLS. You didn't go through outbound to do the client side of TLS and then inbound to do the server side. So that's kind of broadly what is going on as far as I understand it. And so then there's kind of two different things you could do. One is you could say it should go through neither of those. We should treat connections to a pod's own external address as if they are loopback connections. That's kind of approach one in my mind. Approach two is no, we should somehow make it go through both the outbound and inbound policy. So we should somehow, work with Envoy and IP tables and stuff like that to make that happen. That's kind of like approach 1, approach 2.
Mm-hmm.
One comment on the second approach, I think that's pretty risky and intrusive. I mean, I would reduce, anything that touches IP table, I'll be very careful with.
Right, and so this actually relates to Costin. I think I mentioned you in the bug here because there is an IP table rule that is trying to send traffic when a pod talks to its external IP back to Envoy. It's that the listeners don't, like the most specific listener applies and it ends up hitting the inbound listener instead of the service listener. So I kind of wanted to not make it too much different than all the other kinds of places that this happens.
Yeah, can sidecar be used? Because the sidecar allows you fine control over the ports and what gets intercepted and how. You can basically use different ports. You can have so if for the applications that use have this kind of needs, wouldn't be better to recommend using the sidecar and have explicit and no IP tables whatsoever?
I don't, no IP tables at all.
Yeah, because that's what sidecar is, a so-called white box mode where applications are just listening on a port on local host or whatever they need. And the sidecar is listening on a different port. The service is using, and then you can have both of them completely decoupled with no IP table in between. And, that improves scalability, performance, and a lot of other things because you bypass IP tables and also gives you some, on the other side, you lose some control. I mean, it's
yeah. So if you did that, you would have to tell Kafka that even though it thinks it's listening on port whatever, that it's actually listening on the sidecar port instead. That would be one downside of that, I think.
But again, one thing we need to evaluate, and we just started because this white box just got released in 1.1. We are starting to do measurements on what is the actual impact on performance and other things. So in many applications where time is super sensitive, Kafka is usually used for messages where people are super interested in low latency for delivery of messages. So we need to explore the different options, but my personal preference is to minimize risks in line with CodeMove and kind of making sure things are super stable. If we can avoid IP tables, I would rather do that.
So I guess I'll just say I think there's still an unresolved question of what behavior do we want here, because if you don't use sidecar and you have a service and a pod tries to talk to another pod IP, like another pod in the service, it will go through inbound and outbound. If a pod tries to talk to its own external pod IP, it will only go through inbound, and that seems like that I think has to get fixed.
Right.
One way or the other.
So
right, and I also don't think that relates to Kafka. I think we should be able to have a consistent behavior no matter who the other pod is. So and that's one thing. The second, sidecar is like a great CRD. The question is, do we really want to make that mandatory for any pod who want to talk with itself, right? I don't think that's necessarily the case. However, I wonder how, like, just related to your question, what kind of behavior we want. Do we want to bypass everything and have a true loop back, or we want to test our sort of inbound and outbound chains here, right? I don't know how easy it is to implement the first one, because
it's pretty darn easy to implement the thing where you treat it like loopback. Like in the bug, there's an example of we could decide how comfortable we are with this from a stability perspective, but you can cram in an IP tables rule and do that. And that does, there's that's easy. It works in this particular case. I guess I lean towards, if a pod calls its own pod IP address, I think it should go through the policy, the Istio policy that would apply if somebody else in the mesh called that same IP.
But
okay, so
the question here is, why do we have the policy? And policy exists to prevent unauthorized use and increase security. If you are calling yourself what exactly do you gain? Because you already control the code, you already can do whatever you want.
Well, you might want, so the trick here is that Kafka doesn't know that it's calling itself. It's just calling one of the members that happens to be itself. In this case, yeah, MTLS, I agree, is not really a big advantage here, but things like the statistics tracking, so you might want to know, am I evenly balancing traffic between myself and the other things in the cluster?
Statistics
or am I sending nothing to myself?
Right.
Tracing, if it is a virtual service that has virtual service routing, I kind of think we can do something nuanced and say, well, if you call your own pod IP, something special happens. But for me, the simplest thing would be, it looks just like if somebody else called that same IP address.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that probably we can give it an option. Is there are many ways to solve the problem. My main concern is complexity and risks and how much code and spaghetti you are going to introduce to fix a corner case. Because
too much of a corner case, Costin. I totally disagree with that being a corner case. I think it's really the basic case.
Sure.
Right? And I kind of see what Andrew is proposing. He's basically saying that we should still go through the telemetry chain and go through Envoy and be able to do whatever we do, right? And there are some ways to solve that. We talked in the past about this, separating the inbound and outbound listeners. So right now there's a bit of a mess with our listeners, right? So by separating those, we would be able to kind of force the request to go through first to the outbound and then match the inbound, because right now there is no distinction, right? So that's one way to solving that. I'm not sure if, for instance, the change to listen in promiscuous mode would help with anything, but there's definitely a need to look at this and to see how it would interact.
But
right?
That work just started. It's not ready. When it's ready, it will be, probably in 1.2 will be alpha because it's brand new and out of box. And on top of that, we want to add, long term, absolutely, I agree, we should have everything. But in tactical way for 1.2, we need to kind of consider reality of what code we have, what resources we have, what people are working on, and code move. That's the reason I'm trying to push back a bit on major changes that depend on other major changes that are not yet ready.
So, Costin, are you suggesting that for the long term, maybe we will have a better solution using the separation of inbound and outbound, and in the meantime, you are suggesting maybe the sidecar resource works, but I think we should not pass the onus of doing this to the users. This is a pretty simple use case, and if everyone has to configure new resources for making this work.
Yeah, I understand, but it's not all applications. There's a small set of applications, and what I'm saying is, if we have a simple social IP tables, if we can have a small safe IP tables that implements the safest ways that implements one of the solutions, that's perfect. Long-term probably need options, because it's clearly there are distinct requirements for telemetry where we definitely want to go through sidecars, and there are different things about TLS and performance where you don't want to do TLS to encode to secure communication with yourself. So we may let user choose. We may have richer APIs. We may express this in different ways. But what I'm saying is, for 1.2, we need to be as conservative as we can, and then in 1.3 we can do better. It's not like
right. So we're not discussing now where does this feature get into what release. We're investigating the technical solution. So I think we should try in the future to keep those two separate. Not every time we're discussing a technical solution, there is the code move and so on. Let's try to find first what is the best approach, see when we could do that. And if we cannot do it and we need to find some other compromise or creative solution, we can look at that, right? But for now, we just barely made we made the conclusion that we should not go through simply just direct loopback, but we should go through the envoys for telemetry.
Well, we didn't make this decision. That's one opinion, that some people will want to go through it because they want telemetry. Another one is that some people want performance and they don't want to go to envoy. It's not one size, one clear arguments for one or the other. I agree that many people will want telemetry, but I don't agree that everyone will want telemetry.
Okay, so maybe then do you recommend like for the users who wanted one way or another to go and comment in the GitHub issue, because we need to see, like we need to have some data, right? For instance, let's assume
So
that
if you
user want telemetry. Do we have users who do not want telemetry?
Want performance. So any user wants performance.
Yeah, but it's a limited performance when you just call your own pod, right? Like the performance has to be solved cluster-wide, not just in this particular use case.
Well,
I think that if you want the performance, I think that you should call 127.0.0.1. I think if you're calling the external IP, it's because you want it to be treated like it's a connection from somewhere out there. And I don't know how to resolve this, but I don't know. I'm worried that voting on GitHub issues is not necessarily the right outcome.
Yeah.
Maybe voting is not the right solution for this problem. And if you know, if it's something that has multiple solutions that are valid, we can provide an option. We can, you know, prioritize which options to implement first. It's not necessarily that it's an exclusive. We vote today and it's Brexit.
Yeah.
You know, so there are a couple of technical approaches that I sort of just laid out before I went any deeper into this. Some that might be more feasible than others. Like I think there might be an Envoy filter that can, like a listener filter that can help us make this a lot easier. I think maybe what I should do is I should go off and see how awful it would look to do this where it goes through both outbound and inbound, and we can come back and talk. And you know, we can decide, is this horrible and it's going to be way too messy, or is it, you know, is this just going to be you know?
So my main concern is that will probably collide with the work that will happen in reorganizing the listeners. Right, you might like do the new filter. Right now we don't have filter chains for listeners, right? But there is a proposal to actually implement those. So I think we need to see what the TOC decides as work that can be done on listeners, and sort of tie your change with that.
Okay. I guess I would point out that right now, if somebody calls their own pod external IP address, they only go through half of the policy.
Yeah, no, it's clearly a bug. I mean, it's clearly a bug. The question is, how do we solve it? And I don't necessarily agree with Andras that we can just put anything we want and design it and without taking reality into consideration. So there is work on CNI to have you know, the external CNI where traffic doesn't go through IP table, go through route. There is work on separating a filter chain. There are other changes that are happening, and we don't want to go in and make them harder to implement and put constraints to them. So that's what I'm saying, that some gradual approach is probably safer.
Yeah, in any case, we need more on that. We need either like in the GitHub issue or a document with the various, you know, options. And
okay, the GitHub issue has the two options in it: IP tables or trying to get Envoy listeners to behave independently.
Yeah. Let me add the third option with the sidecar to see if it's, because that would be solvable today without any major change.
Yeah.
It would be great, Costin, if you wrote down what that would look like in that issue.
Okay. Any more on this topic? Okay, good. So we're moving to the next one, which are a bunch of multi-cluster issues, links, and PRs by Vadim. Vadim, do you want to talk about this? Share your screen. Please feel free to do so.
Okay, let me try. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. So these are just several small issues. I guess it could be quick to discuss them. Okay, so first of all, currently it's not possible to define a gateway for the local network in the cluster-aware multi-cluster. Okay, so what I propose is to have some reserved word for the local network, to call it local. And this way it will be possible to specify the gateway for the local network Okay, so it will be possible for remote clusters to call the local one. Currently, with the cluster where multi-cluster, it's not possible. It's only possible to call from the local cluster to call remote clusters. It's not possible to call back.
So Vadim, that refers only for the special port for mesh, for internal mesh communication, no? For the one with SNI sniffing and all that stuff.
I guess it can be used for any port.
No, because on port 80, on port 443, I mean the normal traffic that goes into gateway, we definitely need to load balance across all the workloads in the entire mesh, no? It cannot go just local for those.
Yes, right. This is a different issue, what you are talking about.
Okay.
This one is
Okay.
just how to define the local gateway, and so it will be sent to the remote clusters.
So is that the new field in the API? Because I see your changes in the Istio, your PR, right?
Yes, that's where the mesh, the multi-cluster is defined.
Yeah, so this is just a simple change, okay, to
Yeah.
treat the local network, okay. If the network is undefined, to treat it as a local with the name, reserved name local.
Yeah, no, the reserved name is fine. I mean, I think it's a reasonable change and valid concern. I'm just worried if it has implication beyond that or not. I mean, the bug is clear. I mean, it's clear is it should not go to a remote cluster because you're just trying to go in and you may not be able to reach it. But
yeah. Okay. So again, currently the problem is that you cannot reach local cluster from the remote one. Okay, it's only one-way communication currently.
Let me add code move back into discussion. If we can have a test case that can be used in the qualification and end-to-end to verify the behavior, I'm super happy to have this change. But we really need testing for this feature because it's currently completely uncovered by pretty much any test except manual tests.
Yeah,
and
right.
I'm not entirely sure how we're going to validate it and whatever you are changing. So it looks good on paper, but I want to see it on a test.
You mean multi-cluster and general costs and the
Well, for multi-cluster, we do have some tests at least, but for this kind of gateway modes, I'm not aware of any test. We did some manual test only, and that was very limited as well.
there's one very simple test for gateway, but it does need to be expanded significantly.
Yeah. So if we can get it with a test, then absolutely go for it. Otherwise, if it's just another kind of, we need to review it and try to guess it, I will be very reluctant to.
Okay. So we need a test. Okay. So let's talk about the next issue. The idea here is to prevent ping pong, okay, of requests between the gateways. Okay. The idea is that I think that ingress gateways should route traffic to the local endpoints only. Okay, so if an ingress gateway receives a request from some other cluster, it should not send it back to that cluster or to some other cluster. It should let the request to go inside only.
Does it do that currently?
Yeah, it's not. I don't. It's not this way currently.
It's very likely that it's happening.
It doesn't
Yes.
do split horizon really, like.
Yes.
Right?
I'm talking about split horizon. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in some cases it doesn't. It depends on how it is before. Yes, you're right. In the general case, probably it's happening, and it's exactly the same thing I said earlier. We don't have enough testing on this area, so it's very likely that whatever happens, and I guess same solution to add test, verify that it's happening, and fix it. It's clear bug, not.
Yeah. So currently, I think it's happening. Yes. I mean, just from observation. Okay, and the second the second part is symmetric one. Egress gateway should not send the request back to its own cluster. It should let the request pass through to some other cluster.
Well, thank you very much for testing this. That's we should have done it before the release, but yeah, sounds like P0 as well.
Sorry, sounds like what?
Sounds like a P0 as well. I mean, it's clearly
Great. Okay, I'm happy. Okay. So I will work.
I'm not happy.
Okay. So I will work on it as well. And we have the third issue. I propose to use the single ingress gateway and the single port 443 for all the traffic. Okay, so for the traffic between the services. for the traffic between sidecars and remote control plane, mixer and pilot, and also to including access to the Cube API server. So this way we will have connectivity only between the gateways.
Yes.
And we will use the single port. It will be simple. It will be simple to configure the firewall and so on. And in general, the configuration will be simpler. Just to use one single port, 443 standard.
I mean, to split it in two parts. I mean, I was going to propose the same thing for Cube API server to having access with MTLS with our security on top. That's wonderful. And I'll be very happy to see 443. I think I had this. I mean, we maybe had it at some point, but we still need, for the same reason of firewall configuration, we still need a way to configure a different port. I don't mind if the default is 443, but we definitely need to test with a different port because some people want 443 to be used only for normal ingress from outside the world and have DOS protection or all kind of other stuff on top of it. And they need to have a different port. I would personally choose the default to be a different port and allow easy configuration. I'm not against some people having 443 for everything, but I'm just saying it cannot be the only choice. Everything else is super. I mean, API server in particular.
I'm right there with you, Costin. I think that makes perfect sense. I think overloading everything to 443 for some operators is going to be a problem.
And for other one, it's required because, again, there are cases where they cannot open other ports or it's difficult or they have firewalls rules that prevent access. So both of them are super valid in some use cases. We cannot have only one.
So we need both, basically. Yeah.
So I guess this become changing the default value from whatever 15,000 to 443.
No, it's not changing the value. It's modifying so 443 can also work because we are going to keep the 15 whatever, and we are going to add an option to also do everything on 443. And the API server, which again solves the problem of multi-cluster in some cases where the API server is exposed on a private IP or doesn't have proper security.
So say it again, the last
one problem with the current multi-cluster solution relies on API server being accessible on the internet, so that the central pilot or kind of the pilots can query the API server to get remote endpoints. With this, we can solve the case of customers where API server is only accessible on the internal IP, is not publicly, because there's an option in many clusters to not make the API server publicly available. With this, we can use Istio MTLS and security used to connect to the API server from, through the normal gateway without requiring a separate IP address for the API server.
Yeah, okay, agreed.
So how would 443 help with that? Like why doesn't the old gateway, or a different port?
No, it's not related with a different port. It's related with exposing the API server through the gateway, through the mesh gateway. Because right now we expose all services, but API server is not exposed properly because it has a special MTLS and other stuff. It's a bug. We knew about it. It's not. But on both ports it works perfectly fine. It's the same thing.
So it's orthogonal to this, right? Being able to expose the API server.
Maybe it's orthogonal, yes. I'd say it's orthogonal, yes. But yeah, if we can solve it in the same PR, it's perfect. It's not
no, I think we should actually have each change in its own PR.
Yeah, fine.
Separate right. Yeah, agreed.
Run into issues.
So just to update you, Kostin, I already changed the documentation, the example, I think, of cluster aware routing to use the port 443. So for communication between the services in different clusters, they use 443 by default. Yeah, I mean the example.
Is the release?
Yes, I think so.
Oh, okay. Then we should document that there is another option to not use 443. That's it. I mean, and make sure you have tests for both. That's
okay.
To be honest, I'm happy with 443 being the default because it's more common and only advanced users will have firewall rules, and it's much easier to not have to add a new service and port and all the associated overhead. But we definitely need to have the other option tested.
Right. Okay. So just to clarify, there are three types of communications between the services, between sidecar and remote control plane, and between pilot and Cube API server. Okay.
Yep.
So I propose communication between the services by default to use the port 443, and for two other types to use as today and to also allow port 443.
Yeah. And on this topic, there is another port that exists in the mesh config, which is secure DNS, because it is also possible to expose kube DNS through the TLS over DNS over TLS.
Mhm.
But this has a hard code. It is well-defined port that needs to be specified.
Mhm.
If you can leave it in place, that would be perfect.
Okay. Okay.
And that works with core DNS and other DNS servers that can query over DNS over TLS.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. I guess that's it. Thank you.
On the same note, I have a comment related to how we name our features. So this is tagged as multi-cluster, but it is more related to gateway connectivity feature, right? We used to call it 0VPN, then we all agreed to call it gateway connectivity, because wherever this is about service, like in mesh service to service communication across multiple clusters, right? It's traffic that goes via the ingress gateway for the in mesh traffic, correct?
Right. But this one is called cluster aware. Okay, it's not the
This
gateway.
one is called cluster aware by who?
By whoever implements the feature.
Is this
Huh?
split horizon? Is that
Yeah, it's the same as split horizon, but if you look at the documentation, I think it's actually called gateway connectivity. I asked this question on Slack, and I'm not sure exactly when there was, the decision made to rename it one way or another.
So I'm talking about this one, cluster aware.
Okay, I'm already behind. I swear
So
it was
that's how it
gateway
is called.
connectivity probably 3 weeks ago.
Well, whatever the doc writers decided, that's what we
Cluster
have
aware
to.
service routing, man, that sounds
Let's
even.
so?
And gateway-
Where service routing is what split horizon was in the past. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Well, internal names and
horizon
external
is
names.
Right.
We need to trust the doc writers.
You see, like gateway connect. Oh, we do have this.
Yeah, this one, the implementation of Shiram. It's like alternative implementation. This one is federation. You have multiple control planes. Let me show it here. Okay, so
Yeah,
we have two different multi-cluster styles.
Right, but this is about how traffic gets from one place to another. So
Anyway,
anyway,
it's too
it
late
seems
to
like we're
discuss
getting
names.
again into a discussion. But if we are confused, I wonder about how our users feel. Like we have all these flavors and no agreement on how we call them, how we refer to them.
I think we are confused because we use different names, but the users have a single name to look at, which is a documented name, and that's what will be stuck with.
Yeah. So the gateway connected cluster involves basically 0VPN plus multiple control planes, while the cluster aware service routing is a single control plane with 0VPN, or?
There is not really a single control plane anymore. There is a control plane that may be in one or more clusters in all cases. The only question is if the clusters have the same configuration or have slightly different configuration. I mean, if you have uniform configuration, consistent configuration or not. That's the only difference.
But from a user perspective, they don't care about that. How we configure, the gateways and stuff, they don't care. So if I'm a user and I'm trying to figure out which one to choose from here, how do I go?
Depends on what user you are.
Yeah.
Depends on what user you are, because some users care, some users don't care. If you don't care, you use the first choice. If you care, you use the second choice. I mean, if you want to have fine control and super precision, so
that's not a good enough answer.
So I think
it's from a deployment.
Andre
Go
here,
ahead, Steve.
which is that we need better clarity in our documentation around why you would make a specific choice.
Yeah.
One of our three gateway or one of our three multi-cluster implementations, because even I'm confused, and I've been in this for 15 months trying to sort this out. So,
but confusion started with the idea that we have three multi-cluster implementation. We have one multi-cluster implementation that has multiple deployment modes. They are targeted to different categories of users, and they use different technologies to communicate. But in the end, it's allows communication across pods. Do you disagree, Vadim?
No. It's principally two different ways. Okay, for multi-cluster. One is the single mesh. This cluster aware, you have a single mesh, and the other one is federation. You have different meshes connected together. Okay,
Okay.
so it's principally two different ways for multi-cluster.
Right.
Yeah.
So we actually had that document. It was called Istio taxonomy, which talked about the two models, right? Like single and federated. But I see our documentation doesn't really map to that.
Yeah,
right?
so
Because
let me
this is called the gateway connected cluster, and at the very top there, it doesn't say actually what it is. It does say it's a multiple control plane topology. Okay.
Exactly. Yes.
And could you please switch to cluster aware routing? It
Yes.
says,
Okay. Yes, so here.
but that's also, no, the other one, the cluster aware routing. What does it say? At the very top.
Yeah, so it's really not
Single control plane.
Yes,
Okay.
it's also not correct. It's not single control plane topology. It's like you have topology where some clusters do not have a control plane.
Right.
So you have pilot-less clusters and pilot-full clusters. Let's
right.
say.
Yeah, even that is a bit debatable. We can keep talking about names until 3 days when we will not solve it.
Yeah, maybe we can solve it, Kostin. So here I'm just thinking like the federation seems to tie also with the like policies and administrative domain, right? So like I don't know who can take an action item to try to sort of organize this so that it becomes more clear for users that the first one, maybe just rename the menu,
But
yeah, let me do it.
Gateway connected cluster federated or something single,
I think, I mean, I want to say that, federated is probably not the right term. I mean, it's it's not entirely clear that you have to have pilot or not have to have pilot. And again, you may have pilot caches. There are all kinds of technologies that are going to make this difference a bit less visible to users. And I'm not sure I agree even with the statement that in one case you have multiple control planes. You have one mesh, you have one source of truth, and you choose to configure it in a different way. With a new installer, for example, even in a single cluster, you can have multiple control planes and with slightly different configuration. And that's the direction we're moving towards.
Exactly, Kostin. It's a spectrum. There's a whole spectrum from one extreme to another. You could do different things with Mixer, different things with pilots. Yeah. That's part of our problem. We're trying to bundle this into two very specific or three very specific deployments. But the problem is there's a spectrum, and depending on how you install it, you can get anywhere on the spectrum.
And it's not a problem. It's a good thing. I mean, it's a wonderful thing that we have.
Well, it's a problem to document.
It's a problem to document, yes. But as a technology, it's an excellent thing that we can have multiple control planes in a single cluster. We can have clusters with no control plane. We can have a mix of whatever we fit the user needs wherever they are. I mean, it's not we put them in a box or the other.
So John is right, though. The problem with the documentation is that the user reading the documentation has no clue what to do. So that's what we got to fix. That's kind of the root problem here.
And maybe we can fix it by again make it more clear, as he was saying, that it's a spectrum and different. Each panel is basically one way to do it in a specific case, but they are all kind of the same in the end.
Yeah, I think like if it was me, I would probably make reference to being a spectrum, but really focus the details on one or two, well, probably two, specific models.
PR's welcome.
Maybe we need just a short summary right under where it says multi-cluster installation, just a short sort of overview or something talking about the fact that this is a spectrum and maybe depicting, like the various possible deployments, and then saying we will give like two examples or two, of this, like one would be and link to the gateway connectivity and then to the cluster aware, something like that.
Yeah, that's kind of the mental picture I had, Andra, as well.
Yeah.
Right. I was going to say I did open up an issue because we don't talk about the cluster aware at all in the installation portion. That just happens to be an example that you might find.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
I think we just
so-
need to have a better overall in the installation portion.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Eric. Okay, so we have seven more minutes left. So clearly, we can probably move to the next and last topic, which was about. we have two more things. Readiness and endpoints via MCP. So I'll cover this briefly. So with this pilot decomposition, we're trying to remove Kubernetes dependencies in pilot. And right now we have a chicken and egg problems because pilot downloads listeners to Envoy only when the endpoints, the Kubernetes endpoints, are up. Okay, and the Kubernetes endpoints are up only when the pod is up. And the pod is up only when the readiness probe phase, and the readiness probe kind of waits for the listeners. For the ingestions of endpoints via MCP, we need to decouple pilot from this readiness and Kubernetes dependency to the point where it would ingest when it receives endpoints from an NCP source. It means it can really download a listener for that respective endpoint. However, we need a bootstrap solution for that, for the initial readiness probe. And I discussed a bit with Louis about that, and it seems that if we actually make that change about adding a listener for promiscuous mode, that will help with that, with this bootstrap solution. So yeah, these are just some ideas I wanted to circulate because it's something that blocks the multi-cluster with MCP work that Nate and Nino are working on. I'm not sure if anybody else has any proposal on how we could solve this chicken and egg problem. Yeah.
Well, anyway, whenever it's the promiscuous mode is implemented, we can see if it solves the problem and how well it solves. Part of
sure.
I think the importance in one thing I want to add is even in 1.1 and in 1.0, this has been a problem where some pods are failing readiness because of the timing of pilot getting endpoints. So we are already super sensitive to the latency of getting the information about the pods. And this is an area where I want to see a lot of extra testing in the code move, because the startup problems have been always kind of hard to reproduce, hard to test, and we always have people, and any change happens with whatever MCP is deciding to implement, we need to have good test coverage before we make changes, basically. That's kind of the standard for any refactoring, and so I want to make sure we focus on the startup a bit more. Startup testing.
You have a very good point with the latency, Costin, because apparently this special listener would also improve the latency dramatically, right? So
it's a startup latency. Yes, the startup of a pod. We have many cases where the application starts first and then cannot get traffic, or it's in a bad state, or because it cannot be configured because we don't have yet all the replication between the service controller to pilot to back to Envoy. They are half a second, probably less, but it matters. Sometimes it's you have problems.
Mm-hmm.
And on the same note, if I can, actually, let's finish this.
I think we're good. So if
can I have 30 seconds?
Yes, feel free to bring it, I guess, to the next meeting, or just email or talk about that. Yeah. And we can. There is one more item. It's Costin. Okay, Costin.
Yep. So I just wanted to put a link there if people want to try. So I don't know if you know, the console adapter in pilot has been polling. It's doing repeated pollings, and it's not scaling very well, and also doesn't have incremental EDS support. And I'm trying to build a prototype. On that link, you have some half-working, almost proof of concept of a console adapter implementing MCP protocol and using listeners, and so it will work with incremental EDS and with a new MCP. That's if people are interested in console or want to help, please take a look. Otherwise, I'll keep digging on it on my free time. That's it.
So, so you're saying, Costin, this is a new, basically a console MCP source.
It's a refactoring of the console code in Pilot, optimized for watching endpoints instead of polling, and modified to generate synthetic service entries. It has the same readiness problem as the other one, and there is nothing I can do about. But console has its own readiness problem, so it's not affected by that.
Yeah, so this is great. So this is like one step forward towards extracting all the adapter to out of
and the way it is implemented, it's using again, I refactor the XDS code from Pilot, so it's a super tiny implementation of MCP and XDS. It's part of kind of an effort to see how far we can go with optimizing and simplifying the core logic in Pilot. That's it.
Okay, that's super cool. All right, so any more like last minute topics or comments on these questions on Costin's proposal?
I have a different question on what is Iris. I saw that in the notes. Does anybody know?
Iris?
Yeah, IRIS.
Where?
It's
maybe it's a typo.
in the 1-2 notes. Sorry, in the 1-2 notes there.
I think she's a developer at IBM.
Oh, okay.
It's a new feature.
It looked like it was written as a feature. My bad. Sorry.
It's the secret code name.
Yeah, I got it. I'm with you now. My bad.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It's the owner, I guess, of this. All right, good. So we managed to end the meeting on time. Thanks everybody for joining and participating, and see you in 2 weeks. Bye. Have a nice day.
Bye.